coming directly from Phoenix, Arizona to our global audience. We have with us today Scott Whitmore, who is the Vice President of Education for the Association of Business Process Management Professionals and a research supervisor at the Mayo Clinic in Phoenix. Scott, please go ahead and turn on your camera so that the audience can see you. And Scott is a certified IT architect and an ISA fellow. Very excited to have you with us, Scott. Very much looking forward to your presentation. Thanks for taking the time to share your insights and expertise with our global audience today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here this morning. It's this morning for me. It's 8 o'clock this morning, and I'm 3 hours behind East Coast now. And being in Phoenix, Arizona, we don't have daylight savings time, so that changes twice a year. So it's kind of just happened, and it's rather confusing once in a while. We're going to talk about measuring business processes today, and it turns out that all processes have 5 common measures. But why would you want to measure business processes? Well, one of the things you want to do is link to business outcomes. We want to know how to change our business so that we can achieve our business goals. Let's say we want to double revenue in the next 5 years. Where do we invest first, and why would we do that? So we need to link business outcomes to process performance, because the only thing we can really change as managers are the processes and the people that run them and the tools that we use to do that. Business goals drive strategy, so we set our goals and that determines our strategy. So if we want to increase revenue, that means we'll probably have to grow our customers, our current customers. We'll probably have to add new customers. We may have to add new markets or even a new product line. And we have to allocate that. And so we set goals for each one of those areas and then drive that in. And then the people who have to make that happen, they execute that, have to figure that out and decide whether or not the current processes are adequate. So we're looking at the top 3 perspectives of a strategy map, and I use the strategy map because it very clearly defines the areas of concern. We're looking at the financial, the customer, and the internal process. The 4th perspective of the strategy map is what they call learning and growth. Norton and Kaplan call learning and growth. I call tools and technology because it is the skills, knowledge, and tools that you use to execute your processes. And this is where business capabilities lies in that bottom perspective. So we start with financial goals, and we say double revenue. And then in the customer perspective, we say, so what has to happen with our customers in order to achieve that business goal? What kind of increased sales? Can we do it organically? Can we just grow organically? Or do we need to have new customers? Do we need to steal customers from our competitors because there's a fixed size to the market? Or can we expand the market? For internal process perspective, you ask yourself, what do you need to do? What processes need to be in place, and how do they need to be able to perform in terms of capacity and cost structure in order to achieve our goals in the customer perspective? Now, all we can do here is enable them. We can say our processes are sufficient and they perform sufficiently well to achieve what we expect to happen in the customer space, but our customers have to cooperate, and that may not happen in real life. So now we look at what we get out of this is targets for our performance measures. So now we go into process changes. We want to focus on structural measures of the process, not the value delivered, because the value delivered is dependent upon business activity. You can have a high-performing process that is not currently active because there's no business and it's not delivering any value at that point, but it still can perform well. So we're talking potential performance, the performance of the structure itself. It's an inherent ability of a process to deliver value, and depending on how it's exploited. And the word exploited is from Chris Potts. He says that you have these assets and resources and processes, and if you don't exploit them, you don't gain anything from them. So that's the word I use. You want to select measures that reflect your goals. If your goals lean toward productivity, which is input or output oriented, use productivity measures. You can lean towards efficiency if you're looking at conservation of resources. And then you always want to measure defects, because that gives you it's probably the richest source of information about your processes that you'll ever have. Now, we've been harping on measuring defects for 40 years now, And I'm still surprised at how few companies actually measure process defects on a regular basis. We want to use the control chart to monitor the health of ongoing processes. Now, these differ from operational performance ratios because an operational performance ratio depends on actual exploitation business activity. So that any measure that changes because of changes in volume of business is an operational measure. If it doesn't change because business activity changes, it's probably structural. And again, a very capable process that isn't used won't generate any measurable values. So a structural performance ratio provides insight into the health and performance of the business organization, processes, and other structures. They're based on manageable and observable characteristics, things you can actually see and touch, and they focus on inputs or outputs, and are technology and organizationally agnostic. And this is all from Chris Potts' book, Recreation. If you've read that trilogy, it's now a 4-part trilogy. It's worth the read. Each one of the 3 books is probably a 4-hour read, and they go from everything from investing in IT to enterprise architecture. Well worth the information. Now, business unit leaders are the ones that are ultimately responsible for the processes they use. Processes are monitored to make sure they stay within performance line parameters, and measures depend greatly on the process and the natural statistics of the work. Processes generally vary greatly in terms of how long it takes to do something. There's random variation, and you can focus on that on the non-random part and look for trends, and we use a control chart to do that. Here we have a sample control chart. The dots are the actual observations of process measures, and this happens to be a manufacturing process where you have the same outcome every time, and you record the actual results over time. The heavy dashed lines labeled UCL and LCL are 2 standard deviations above and below the mean, which is the center line. Generally, anything that falls within that range, plus or minus 2 standard deviations, is random noise, and you don't need to worry about it. But if that trend line, the dotted line, starts to angle up towards one or the other, or down towards the other control limit, then you may have a change in your process, and you may want to start looking at it. If there's a sudden jump that falls outside that range, you probably want to look at that too, because that's what's called an uncommon or extraordinary cause, and needs to be looked at. This is a standard tool that we learned from W. Edwards Deming back in the day. But again, it's surprising how few people actually use this for everyday business processes. So let's talk about a sample linkage. We want to increase net revenue, which is sales minus returns, by 20%. Among other things, we want to increase online orders by 40%. So this is what we expect our customers to do. We expect them to order more online than they do now. This requires a 20% increase in our logistics capacity, and because we know that because of where we're operating now in terms of current capacity, and a shift in fixed variable costs to lower total costs. So we need to make some changes in how the logistics organization functions in order to lower its total cost as business increases. And that might mean automation. That's usually what it means, is automation. So here are your 5 common measures. All processes have a capacity. They have an activity cost, or more than one activity cost typically. They have a cycle time, they have a defect rate, and then they have a fixed variable cost mix, or what I call a cost structure. So when you hear cost structure or cost mix, this is typically what we're talking about, is the ratio of fixed to variable costs. Now we can measure these for every process, no matter what it is. Practical capacity, I take my capacity and activity cost measurements from time-driven activity-based costing. It's a back-of-the-envelope method of allocating costs to activities that makes it very easy to analyze processes. Most processes are executed by people in the end, and people have a fixed capacity for executing, doing work. Generally, it's measured in minutes per quarter. You can talk about, there's a standard calculation for that, and there's a maximum sustainable output for other resources. So if you have an automated process, it might be the transactions per minute in terms of the electronic processing capacity, Or if you have a manufacturing capability, it's whatever the bottleneck is in the slowest unit in the manufacturing line, whatever that is, and that is your capacity. Variable load can be handled by assigning additional capacity to handle off-peak loads or peak load transactions occasionally, and we do that kind of thing all the time in systems design. Holiday retailers do that all the time when they hire people for the holidays. So we're going to assume a shipping department that employs 28 people, not including managers and support staff. These people are the ones that pick and pack and load the trucks. They work an average of 20 days per month and are paid 7.5 hours or 27,000 minutes per quarter. Each person then spends 75 minutes per day on breaks and meetings on average, leaving 22,500 minutes per quarter. Times 28 people, the department has a capacity of 630,000 minutes per quarter. Now, minutes per quarter or minutes per month is the normal measure. One of the reasons is I don't use dollars is because you can change the capacity in dollars by simply changing the budget, which is a manipulation, not an actual change. Activity cost, this is how long it takes to do something. And we always measure this in minutes, again, because you can change the cost by just changing the budget of the department without actually changing the process at all. So you might have what appears to be an improvement, but you haven't actually changed anything. And this is the time required to do each activity in the process. So and these can be done by direct observation, or you ask a person in the shipping department, how long does it take to pack an order typically? What are the things that cause it to go longer? What causes variation? Well, things like customs forms or packing fragile items or hazardous material might take extra time to pack. And they can tell you that, or you can just observe that directly. Variations can be handled by estimating the additional time and then adding that up for a particular transaction. So generating a quote might add 15 minutes to the time to process an order. So if you have to generate a quote on a sales order, for example, that might take extra time, so there's extra paperwork. In filling out customs forms for an international shipment might take an extra 10 minutes for the order. And then you add to that the 2 or 3 minutes per item that it takes to pick it. This is an order processing department example. Process a customer order takes 8 minutes, a customer inquiry takes 44 minutes, and to perform a credit check takes 50 minutes. Now, it's probably no longer valid because credit checks are pretty much automated these days. But total customer service time in a period is 8 minutes times the number of orders, 44 minutes times the number of inquiries, and 50 minutes times the number of credit checks. And these values can be used to estimate resources. So if you want to know what your capacity for processing orders is, you have a fixed number of minutes. What's your mix of activities today, and how many orders can you fit into that 630,000 minutes or whatever it is? To change that, you can say, well, we're going to do fewer inquiries, or we're going to handle fewer credit checks, or we're going to automate credit checks and make that 5 minutes instead of 50. So you can change the process to do that and increase your capacity simply by reducing the activity cost of one of the activities. Cycle time is a classic process measure. It goes back to the days of Six Sigma and total quality management. It's activity time, so the time actually spent working, plus wait time plus delay. Now, wait time and delay are different. Wait time is time required for external events, such as drying paint or curing concrete, or waiting for a regulatory agency to approve something, permit maybe, or an external customer to provide something. Delay is the time spent on the manager's desk waiting for a signature or somebody else to do an internal approval, or the time that the order spends in a queue before it gets picked. Wait time is not something you can manage, and the reason we separate them is because you can manage delay and you can tack delay and try to get work delay out of the system. Wait time is not something you can deal with on a regular basis. It requires collaboration and cooperation, but it's something that can be managed. It just takes longer and it's harder. Every process creates defects. The defect rate, which is the defect instances per opportunities, or some power of 10, usually millions of opportunities, depending on how often the process is executed, is the rate. That rate is inherent in the structure of the process. In order to change that defect rate, you have to change the process. You have to invest money in the process in order to fix that. Other attributes of a defect are how much does it cost when it occurs, how much does it cost to fix, and what are the root causes. And one of the things that we do with defects is do root cause analysis using Pareto charts, where you order the frequency of each root cause by the frequency of occurrence and attack the biggest root causes the soonest. I was working on a software team. We went from 13 people to 40 people in a period of about a year, trying to reduce our 2-week cycle time for change requests. We got to the point where we were releasing about 100 changes a week. We did a release every week, and we reduced doing about 100 changes a week. The wait time was still 2 weeks because it turned out that that was what people were willing to wait for a change, and the length of the queue just got longer, but it was still 2 weeks long. But what we discovered was there was a class of error called production incident, which the software crashed to the point where it stopped the factory from working until we fixed it. And we were getting to the point where we were doing about 5 of those a week. We looked at root causes of that. We stopped everything and just did a root cause analysis. So why are we stopping the factory? And it turns out that one change was typically we had cross feed from one program to another, and that when we changed one program often, another program didn't get changed as necessary. And we fixed our documentation, and that one change eliminated all of those production problems. We were down to less than 1 a month at that point, and was 50% of the total defects that we were generating as a team. So one change can have a lot of impact depending on how frequently it occurs. The defects tell you a lot about your process. We never would have discovered that problem if it hadn't been for the defect rate. The number of defects that occur will rise and fall with business activity. So that's an operational measure. The rate, which is per opportunity, is fixed by the process itself. Now, there's times when the rate will increase as you approach practical capacity because you start to get stress in the system and errors. So that's a key, it's a clue that you might be approaching your practical capacity if the rate starts to drift up as you approach a capacity limit. Again, you can see this on the control chart if you track the defect rate with its own control chart. This one gets interesting. This is the fixed variable cost. Fixed costs are what you pay to have capacity on hand. Whether you use it or not, you pay the same amount. So that's the cost of having a factory, or the cost of having an IT system that automates the process. They don't change with business activity. Variable costs are what you pay for business activity. And there's total costs are always a mix of the two. Volume of 0 means you have no variable costs and all you're paying are fixed costs. But you have some point where as business activity increases, your total costs go up. Variable costs can be time, services, or materials. So you can have that, how much does it cost to execute a service, for example? If you're not executing that service, it's 0. But the fixed cost is if you're a plumbing supplier, a plumber's service, you have to have the plumber on hand, you have to have the tools, you have to have the parts, you have to have the truck. Those are your fixed costs. The variable cost is how long does it take and how much time does it spend on the call. In the following charts, excuse me, variable cost equal total cost minus fixed cost. So we look at we plot total cost and we plot fixed costs. Variable cost is the difference between lines. This is the cost model, cost curve, or cost structure, other names for this. So here's a sample cost curve, and you can see that fixed costs are right around 22 million per year. As volume increases, variable costs increase up at a fixed rate in this case. It's not always a straight line, but it usually is. If you want to change the cost curve, what you're looking at doing, and this is what I recommend, is a capability roadmap. You show your current cost curve in the blue and green lines. And what we're going to say is we're going to invest X number of dollars to increase the fixed cost from roughly 24 to roughly 26 or 28 or whatever that number is. But the variable cost curve is going to be much flatter, so that at current capacity, total cost is lower. And as we increase our business, total cost doesn't grow nearly as fast. A long time ago, president of Boeing asked the question of his senior managers, we pay several $100 million a year for Boeing Computer Service, which at that time was a separate division. And what do we get out of it? And my immediate thought was, well, let's just turn them off and see if we make it through the next payroll. Well, we also delivered 100,000 planes that year, or 400 that year with 100,000 employees. The last time they delivered 400 planes, they had 200,000 employees. So the total cost for the delivery of airplanes was much lower than it was the previous time. And so by automating more and spending more in computing, they were able to lower their variable cost to the point where the total costs were actually less than they had been in the past. So this is what you talk about when you say changing the cost curve. And this curve is important when you look at taking on new business. Another one is other capacities, another one, but you look at the cost curve and say, well, how much is it going to cost to operate at that capacity? Can we actually afford that? If we had to hire people to do that, bring on a new factory or something like that, can we afford to do that? And is there some other way that we could do that? So we're looking at changing the cost curve at this point. Most IT investments, most investments in automation are to do just this. You look at, you invest in automation, which raises your fixed cost, hopefully lowering your variable cost to the point where your total costs drop or don't go up as fast. Again, if you start as a business architect, if you start talking in terms of cost curves and capacities and activity costs, people start listening because this is where they live all the time. That is the end of my presentation. I can go back and cover some more details if that's what you want to have some more. I've got some more slides in here about some more examples of how to calculate this stuff. But that is the material to cover. Are there any questions? Jose, back to you.
Very well, Scott. Thank you for that. A deeper dive onto process measurements and gauging the health of our processes. So unless you want to share other slides, I would ask that you stop showing the screen to the audience now, and I'll come back on here and talk about relay some of the questions that we have from the audience. And let me bring my camera back on. And for those in the audience, some of your questions already have come through. Keep posting them. I'm keeping tabs on your commentary, and I'll relay the questions to Scott. So Scott, of course, the ultimate. There are a number of themes that emerge in terms of questions. We have a very deep audience with Lean Six Sigma master black belts who can probably discuss each one of your slides for the next 8 hours, and so we're not going to go there. But one of the overall themes is kind of, you can go back all the way to Albert Einstein, that not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. And so when he talks about measurements, not everything that matters can be measured, and not everything that's measured, not everything that we measure matters. So a lot of process owners, when it comes to determining the health of their processes, they own complex processes. It would be awesome to have an aircraft with a single gauge that tells you everything about how the flight is going. You usually don't have that. You have multiple gauges that you have to be looking at, and then you have to prioritize. And then there's a cost, between quality, cost, and schedule for the multiple gauges for those. There's a cost of acquiring that data. I'm curious about, from a practical standpoint, how do process owners in more complex processes, which most of the business processes today are quite complex, multi-dimensional. What are some practical suggestions you have for them to narrow down the list of the trivial many things that you can measure versus the critical few in a way that's cost effective for them?
Well, I'll answer that with a couple of stories. I was working at T-Mobile when when the announcement, AT&T announced that they were acquiring T-Mobile, and we went to work the day after the announcement, and everybody was, I don't want to work for AT&T, and I don't want to do this, and this is a bad deal. And I said, well, that's not the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is if the merger doesn't go through and we're cut loose, because our parent company, which at that time was Deutsche Telekom in Germany, had already said, we're going to cut them loose. We're going to make them independent. And I says, the reason that's a bad news is our cost structure doesn't support that. As a company, we generate about $5 billion a year in free cash flow. That's enough to make a profit, or it's enough to invest in the network, but you can't do both. So we would have to make a change. We'd have to invest in how the company was run, inherently run, and in order to improve that, make that profitability to stand alone as a division. Later on at Nordstrom, they had a goal of opening 300 of their discount rack stores every year. And they had the processes in place to acquire the real estate and hire the staff. What they found was they couldn't do that because they couldn't hire managers fast enough and get them trained. They were using department assistant managers to become department managers in the new stores, and they'd used up all of the assistant managers they had and couldn't replace them fast enough. So that was a capacity issue, but it was totally unrelated to what everybody thought was a capacity issue. So you want to ask yourself in terms of current operations, day-to-day operations, are we performing profitably enough? Is our cost structure good enough to generate the revenue or the profit that we need right now, the gross margin or the net margin? And if not, what do we need to do to change that? To take on new business, new goals, such as increased revenue, you have to look at, do we have the capacity? If not, where do we get it? How do we generate that? So there's some options at this point. You might need to, if customer service is an issue, if your customer experience is bad, you might want to look at defects. What are the defects in the processes that deliver your customer experience, for example? How often do customers have issues dealing with you as a company? And look at defects there. So these are kind of things you can look at that are inherent in the process that you can actually fix as managers. Because you can say, if you have bad customer experience, well, what can we do to change that? And how do we make that better? And you look at what's causing those defects. And the defects in a customer service or customer experience would be complaints and that customer service gets. You might look at those. When Hewlett Packard was dealing with the printer division, they looked at customer service because that was the richest source of information about the performance of the printers. Was, what are customers complaining about, or what are they calling about? Good news is also valuable too. Good experience that customers have. So there's always the information available to analyze that you can look at to say, and it's one of these 5 measures, because these 5 measures are built into the process. In order to change any of them, you have to invest money in the process to do that. In my view, a good competent process manager would already know all those numbers and be able to say right away that if somebody says, well, we need to increase capacity, or we need to increase sales, or we want to increase gross margin, they know right away whether their process is going to have to change. And it should just be an instinctive thing. If not, you look at your business architects, because they should have that information. The people who know this kind of stuff are the ones who are really valuable in a company.
Very well, very well. And Scott, one of the themes that also has emerged on the questions is that if you can talk a little bit more about the differences between applying these principles in manufacturing versus transactional processes. Are there fundamental differences in the way that you would approach a manufacturing process versus a transactional process in IT, for example, or any other transactional process for that matter? Or the fundamentals are the same and you apply them pretty much the same way?
The fundamentals are the same. The difference is the volume of transactions. In the manufacturing process, you do it more often, so you have more data. And so it's easier to see trends. It's easier to make sense of activity costs, because you look at it, and this activity is in this workstation, and it requires 20 minutes to do this step of the manufacturing process and move on. When you look at, say, software development, for example, it's a little more difficult because you don't repeat it as often. What is the productivity of a story point? What's the capacity of your development staff? In terms of units, what are the units they produce? Is it user stories? Is it features? Is it lines of code? What is your measure of output? And that's an issue with a lot of business processes, is that it's hard to agree on what the output is. What is it you're doing? So we look at activities. A customer order is a fairly discrete activity. You can look at, you can follow it from one end to the other and say, well, this takes 10 minutes to do, or it takes 25 minutes to pack an order, an average of 5 minutes per item. So you have the order plus the number of items, and you can average that out. The method I use for calculating that are all back of the envelope calculations that are very quick, very macro. They're not necessarily inaccurate, but they're not very precise, and they're precise enough, because if you start looking at, if you know that you have, say, 650,000 minutes a quarter of capacity in terms of staff, you can pretty much lay out different mixes, and you can run a spreadsheet that says what are the alternate changes of various activities to show what your new capacity is. So it's pretty easy to do with any kind of process if you have the right numbers.
Those are very helpful perspectives, as we have I think a very cross-industry audience here that lives both in manufacturing and probably even a little more heavily weighted towards transactional processes. So those are good insights. We're going to have a conference coming up that's going to be a focus on healthcare. I know you have deep experience in healthcare, working with and for the Mayo Clinic for quite some time. Curious about how if you have an example or maybe a little bit deeper view on how you apply this process measurements to healthcare operations and business processes.
Well, I can tell you one of the processes that we looked at in the neurosurgery department was the time it takes to get an appointment. It was running around 35 days. You called and you needed a brain operation, or even a consult with a physician. It would take 35 days to get that on the schedule, and they worked very hard to reduce that. I think it was 15 days. They added neurosurgeons. They changed the way they did their clinical hours, which is where they talked to patients outside of the operating room. They changed the way they do operations, and so they did a lot of work throughout the department to reduce this time. And this was a measure of cycle time for the scheduling process. The Mayo has a fairly unique scheduling system that is still largely manual. You call a group of people and they schedule the specialist, the team, because they're trying to pull together a team of people from multiple specialties to handle the issue. And so we haven't been able to automate that, or haven't spent the effort to automate that a lot of companies or a lot of organizations have. But that's an example of the kind of thing that you look at and how you might work that. Another one would be queue times for imaging, which is significant in a lot of institutions, or the time in the ER. The ER is highly measured because it's a critical time. Healthcare is a very labor-intensive business, and for a lot of reasons, and it's not just because we don't make the effort to automate it, because we still have medical professionals that have to be in the loop to make decisions and approve diagnosis and things like that.
For sure. William Fuller asks a specific question here. You mentioned early on the trilogy of the 4-hour reads. Could you repeat for him what those books and author and books were about?
Chris Potts is the author, Potts. The first book is called Fruition, and it's about investment in technology and transforming IT from an internal supplier to the investment managers of the business in terms of process change. If you look at your investment portfolio, your process change list, project list in your IT, it's a list of process changes or people, changes that people want to make. And you want to make sure that that aligns with the needs of the business, not just somebody's wish list of things they want to do, which is what most people have as their investment. The second book is called Recreation, and it's about enterprise architecture. And there's a newly promoted, these are all novellas. There's short stories with a cast of characters that go through, and you get drawn into the story as well as learning some things. And he goes through, well, the CEO hires this guy on as the chief enterprise architect, and the first thing the CEO says is, I'm the chief enterprise architect. It's my job to make sure the enterprise is structured sufficiently to function as an organization. And you're helping me out here. So this is what I want you to look at. So he goes from business to business unit, and they talk about different problems and they troubleshoot. And he learns about true enterprise architecture from that standpoint. The next book is called, what's it called? I don't remember what the last name, what the name of, but these are all one-word names. But it's another story of the same cast of characters, although one of the characters comes in from the first book. But it's the same company. They talk about more about enterprise architecture. But those books are where I get the idea of structural performance measures. He talks about measuring, architects manage structures, so they're interested in how the structure performs, regardless of how the business is performing. And so this is where we get these structural performance measures from.
That's
De-friction.
excellent.
That's the one. De-friction is the third book.
De-friction. Okay.
Yeah.
Very well. Very well. There we go, William. You got the trilogy there.
Hey, if
Scott,
I might, you made a comment real early on in the questions about some important things can't be measured. One other resource that I would suggest is Douglas Hubbard's How to Measure Anything. Anything can be measured. If it matters, it can be measured because it has an effect, and you can measure the effect, if even indirectly. So my view of that is that if you can't measure it, it probably doesn't matter. If it matters, there's a way to measure it. So we'll go with that.
very well, very well. To wrap up, what is your best advice for people, leaders, organizations who are trying to get started in the right path for measuring the health of their business processes? What would you suggest that how they approach that?
The first step would be to, I would start with defects. What's the defect rate? And just start charting that. Don't worry about causes right now. Just track the defect rate and see what it is. You might be shocked as to how high it is or whatever. You need to pick a reasonable denominator. Is it opportunity, million opportunities, thousands of opportunities? Pick a denominator that gives you a number that's in the single to double digits that you can measure it, you can manage it. Then start measuring capacity and activity cost. You can start looking at the activities in that process and say, well, how long does it take to do these things? And start measuring those in minutes. You'll find that, especially if you start measuring distinguishing delay versus wait time, you can look at that, and cycle time comes along with it. So that's not something you set out to measure directly. But the activity cost is something you can actually change. Now, how much would it cost to reduce this activity from 15 minutes to 5, for example? And then the cost structure is, your finance people already know what your cost structure is, and you can get that information. And I'd start plotting that. If you have one of those charts on the wall that shows your cost structure projected out through various volumes, you could glance at that and say, well, if we want to raise capacity 20%, it's going to cost 40% more. And you can look at that right away and see that. So these are all easy things to start calculating with, and generally most people already have the data. They just don't have it in the format that they think they do.
Scott, terrific. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise with us today in this very important area of measuring business processes, understanding capabilities, measuring success. So we appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise and insights on this subject.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Scott Whitmore, the Vice President of Education for the Association of Business Process Management Professionals and a research supervisor at the Mayo Clinic in Phoenix, Arizona. Grateful for the insights on the measurement of business processes. Now, we are going to take a break, and at the top of the hour, we're going to have a terrific session on how to leverage innovation and entrepreneurship in the global space ecosystem. And we're going to have the Chief Operating Officer for the Space Foundation sharing with us directly how that's being done on the leading edge of exploration of technology development. Very excited about that. Very much looking forward to the presentation by Shirley Brunswick, who again is the Chief Operating Officer for the Space Foundation. So I will see you back soon at the top of the hour with Shirley Brunswick.